Hello and welcome everyone to our fourth session of the Heifer Management webinar series. I would like to thank everyone for being here with us and to go over the topic of successful pair or group rearing of calves, common challenges and options for solutions. Today we have Dr. Jennifor Van Os, who is an assistant professor and extension specialist in animal welfare from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Oops. So I am delighted to welcome Dr. Jennifor Van Os as our speaker for today's webinar. With a wealth of experience and expertise in animal behavior and welfare, Jennifor is known for her skill and knowledge towards the implementation of best practices in management and housing. Jennifor brings years of experience to the dairy industry, graduating from Harvard University with a BA in psychology and from the University of California, Davis with a PhD in the interdisciplinary animal behavior graduate program. She completed her postdoctoral work at the Department of Animal Science at UC Davis in 2016 and in the Animal Welfare Program at the University of British Columbia, Canada in 2017. Jennifor's passion to answer the grand question of why for many facets of animal and human behavior and perceptions is evident throughout her scientific works and the success of her lab program. By approaching research and management questions with an investigative mindset, Dr. Van Os dives deep into how the environment, management, and handling decisions affect cattle and how the physical and behavioral needs of a dairy animal changes throughout their life and across life stages. We are honored to have Jennifor share her insights with us today, and I am certain that her expertise will enrich our discussion and provide invaluable takeaways for all participants on successful pair or group rearing of calves. Welcome, Dr. Jennifor Van Os with the University of Madison, Wisconsin. Take it away.
Thank you. So I will go ahead and share my slides now, if you could enable me, please.
Yes, you should be able to. I do see them up, so you are good.
Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to jump in today to talk about some common challenges and potential solutions, and we'll have a little bit of an interactive portion for people who are able to join us live. So I don't want to rehash what has already been said in previous parts of this webinar series, but I do want to mention that a few years ago, I put together this free resource guide that's available on my website. And this was a collaborative effort with experts on calf care and welfare and nutrition, veterinarians, et cetera, from different institutions. And so I have a link there as well as a QR code. And again, this is completely free. It's a series that kind of walks you through what are the various benefits of pair group housing, and then some factors that could go into your decision making to either try pair housing or to make some adjustments to make sure that you have successful outcomes. So I am not going to go over in detail what's in this first article, Why All the Fuss About Pair Housing, because I know that there was recently a presentation by Emily Lindner from University of Florida. But I'm just going to review really quickly kind of bullet point summary of the different types of benefits that have been found in scientific research, and which I think also producers have seen in their own experience. So when you house calves in pairs or small groups, it addresses this need that they have as a herd species to have social contact with each other. And so we see an increase in play behavior, which is sometimes seen as a positive welfare indicator. It helps the calves' social development, so they learn how to get along with others. We've also seen evidence that they become more resilient to stress, particularly around weaning, and that it helps their what's called cognitive development, so basically their learning ability, and helps them adapt to new situations. We also have some evidence from my lab that housing calves in pairs, particularly in outdoor hutches, can provide some protection against cold stress in the winter. And then we also see many, many studies documenting an increase in solid feed intakes and weight gains when calves are housed in pairs or groups. And then finally, a benefit that doesn't affect the calves directly, but affects the dairy industry, is that there is some evidence that public acceptance for pair group housing is greater than for individual housing. And so I just want to put an ad down there for one of the previous presentations by Emily Lindner in this series. So on April 30th, she talked about the impacts of social housing on performance and production. So if you want to learn more, you can watch her presentation or you can access our fact sheet. So today I'm going to talk about 3 common challenges that we hear about when people do transition from individual housing to pair or group housing. So the first is, how can we make sure that calves and pairs or groups stay healthy? So there are historical reasons why the industry moved towards individual calf housing as the status quo, and a lot of that had to do with calf health. But what we see now in the industry is that farms who do raise calves in social groups, so either pairs or groups, can often do so quite successfully and hit good benchmarks for calf health. And so we conducted a survey a few years ago here in Wisconsin, but we had producers responding from all over the US, and we asked them how satisfied they were with the health of their calves. And about 3/4 of farmers who were using pair group housing said that they were satisfied with calf health. And we know that there are a lot of different factors that contribute to calf health. And so a lot of the same principles apply whether you're housing your calves individually or in pairs or groups. And so some of these ingredients include a good preventive care and monitoring program, good colostrum management, proper nutrition, especially your milk or milk replacer feeding program, and then practices around hygiene, sanitation, and biosecurity, as well as adequate ventilation and air exchange. And related to that, enough space allowance. So enough 3D space in terms of the amount of air for air exchange, but also linear space on the floor and enough clean, dry, comfortable bedded area. And then if you are managing calves in a group or even in a barn in individual pens, it's important to practice all in, all out moves rather than trickle in, trickle out. So before I talk about some of these factors, I want to discuss some of the benchmarks that we recommend that a farm achieve before they transition to pair housing. So this is kind of a way to check what is the status of calf health in your herd and decide then, are you ready to move to pair housing? So one of the benchmarks we look at is calculating the mortality rate among pre-weaned calves on the farm. And we're pulling this from the Dairy Calf and Heifer Association's gold standards. And what they suggest is having a benchmark of less than 3% mortality during the pre-weaning period. And the way they calculate that is they exclude stillbirths. So in the research literature, stillbirths are sometimes defined as death within the first 24 hours after birth, and sometimes it's defined as within the first 48 hours. But with this definition, we're just going to call it the first 24 hours. So the way you would calculate this is on your numerator, you would take the number of calves which died between 1 day old and 60 days old. And then in the denominator, you divide by the total number of calves born per year, but you subtract out those stillbirths between 0 and 24 hours after birth. And so the target is to try to achieve less than 3% mortality if possible. And of course, this isn't a magic number. There's not necessarily a huge difference between 2.9 and 3.1, but it's just a rule of thumb to try to achieve. The second benchmark that we talk about is looking at evidence of transfer of passive immunity. And so, of course, there are a few different ways to measure this. And historically, we talked more about pass-fail, but more recently, new guidelines have been published categorizing the level of transfer as excellent, good, fair, or poor. And so what I've done here is reproduced this table that shows the latest guidelines, and there are 3 different ways that you can measure for transfer of passive immunity. And so what these guidelines suggest is that you would like at least 40% of the calves in your herd to be in this excellent category, and then about 30% as good, 20% as fair, and fewer than 10 as poor. And again, these are just guidelines. But in talking with some other colleagues, we have set this target that ideally less than 5% of calves should be considered poor. So in this table, it says less than 10. But if you're considering moving to pair group housing, we suggest having a little bit of a stricter standard in case that transition does result in some new problems emerging. So again, the 2 benchmarks are mortality under 3% and calves with poor transfer of passive immunity under 10 or ideally 5%. So what I've done is prepared some case study examples that are drawn from data from real farms. And so this is the first hypothetical one here. So in this scenario, we have this farm I'm calling Sweet Cream Farm, and they milk 650 Holsteins, and their calf mortality rate in the last year was 7.6%, excluding stillbirths. And when they measured for transfer of passive immunity, 16.7% of calves were in the poor category. So for those who are able to participate live, I would like to launch a poll and see what your opinion is on how ready this farm is to move to pair housing. So the options are yes, I think they're probably ready based on these data. No, they're probably not ready, or I'm not sure based on this information.
I do have the poll launched, and we have all of our participants who have submitted answers.
Okay. Okay, great. So some people said, no, I think this farm's probably not ready. Another person said, I'm not sure based on this information. So we are providing limited information. And one, that's actually a good point, because sometimes I get the question, well, why aren't you directly measuring morbidity rates or something like that? So I'm just trying to guess what's going on in those people's heads. And so the answer to that question is in our article or fact sheet series, we do talk about that, but since definitions can be quite inconsistent, not only from farm to farm, but actually in the scientific literature. That's why we stuck with these measures that are a little bit easier to calculate. But yes, that's also an important factor. So I would probably say in this case, based on the benchmarks that we have established, that this farm's probably not ready. And so at the very least, they'd want to keep measuring to see, is this a consistent trend or are things heading in a better direction? So the benchmarks were 3% mortality or 5% of calves with poor transfer of passive immunity. So let's do one more example. So now I have Cookies and Cream Farm, and this farm milks 1,200 Holsteins. Their calf mortality rate in the last year was 3.4%, excluding stillbirths, and their transfer of passive immunity, when they measured it, there were 6.2% of calves in the poor transfer category. So same question with the next poll. Do you think this farm is ready to move to pair or group housing?
And the poll has been launched. All right.
Okay, so everyone said no, they're probably not ready. And I think that's really interesting because oftentimes when I do this poll, I get answers completely across the board. And this one was meant to be kind of ambiguous. And so I think here actually it's just a judgment call. It's really up to your comfort level if you're the farmer here or the veterinarian who's consulting with them, where the 3% benchmark for mortality and the 5 or 10% benchmark for passive transfer, neither is really a magic number. And so for somebody like me, I'd probably just want to keep measuring for a little bit of time and see, are things going in an upward trend, downward trend? Are they heading the right direction? So some people might say, you know what, this is really close enough. It's not a magic number. Let's just go for it. Others might not be comfortable. So I think in this case, there's actually no right answer. Okay, and so I had mentioned earlier that calf health has a lot of different factors that go into it, and we need to pay attention to a lot of the same considerations, whether we're raising calves in pairs, groups, or individually. But there are some specific considerations when we're talking about pairs or groups, and that we talk about this in one of our articles where we discuss grouping strategies. So one thing that we need to think about is the group size. And so what I want to show here is a comparison of a few studies that looked at individually housed calves versus pair housed calves. And I have a little caveat there that when I say pair housing, I don't mean putting two calves into one individual hutch. I mean providing an adequate space allowance. So that's just one thing to note. And so what I'm summarizing here is the plus represents that the pair or group housed calves did better in terms of the outcomes that were measured. The equal signs indicate that in those studies, the calves performed equally. There was no difference detected regardless of housing. And the red minus sign indicates that the pair or group housed calves performed worse in terms of health outcomes compared to those in individual housing. And then the big numbers refer to the number of studies, and then I have like the references noted there. So if we're looking at pairs or small groups of 3, most studies find that calf health is about the same. But another thing to consider is group size. And so here I'm summarizing the same type of information, but from a literature review conducted by my colleague, Terry Olivet. And what she found specifically with indicators relating to respiratory disease is you can see there's all zeros in that plus sign column, but then there's a mix of studies that found no difference between individually and pair group house calves, and then some studies that found worse outcome for group house calves. So one of her conclusions was more research is needed. You can see these numbers are very small. It is kind of challenging to do these studies because you need adequate sample size, but also that she detected group size as a risk factor. So larger groups can be more challenging to manage in terms of calf health. So I would say larger groups are not for everyone. You really do need to have your ducks in a row when it comes to managing calf health. So one of the questions we get is, well, what's the optimal group size? And so a lot of people will say pairs are really a good compromise because then you're achieving full social contact and getting a lot of those benefits that we see in the literature, but you're not facing this challenge in terms of group size. And I would say a lot of farms actually do manage small groups, so bigger than 2, between maybe 3 to 8 successfully. And so the goal when you're forming your group is you want to minimize disease and you want to minimize competition. So to make sure all calves can access food and water resources. And whatever that group size is going to be determined by is your age range that you want to try to keep narrow. And that's going to be determined by the calving rate on your farm. So the greater the age gap between calves in a group, the more competition. And so when we have asked veterinarians for their opinions before, we've heard this recommendation that the oldest and the youngest calf should have no more than a 2-week age difference within a pair or a group, ideally only 1 week of difference. And so when we surveyed veterinarians, 80% of them said they would like to see calves within a pair or group be just 1 week apart in age. We also surveyed farmers to see what they were actually doing if they were using pairs or groups. And so you can see here we have them categorized as more than 3 weeks apart, 3 weeks or less, 2 weeks or less, or 1 week or less. And so if you add up those bottom 2 bars, about 3/4 of farms had that 2-week or shorter age gap. And actually about half had the calves within a week of age, which is what the vets were recommending. A similar question is what should be the age of the calves when you form these pairs or groups? And here we don't really have expert consensus. So we asked veterinarians, well, what do you think? And I was actually really surprised by these results because in talking to producers kind of one by one, I thought that veterinarians would want to wait until calves are 3 weeks or older. But actually in our veterinarian survey, over 2/3 of the vets who responded to us said that they would prefer that calves be paired together when they're 2 weeks old or younger. And so if we look then at our farmer survey, we indeed found that 3/4 of farms were creating these pairs when the calves were 2 weeks old or younger. So what the vets are saying and what the producers are doing are actually lining up quite well. So I want to now turn to another polling question. There's just a little bit of mental math here, but now we're going to talk about this farm, Butter Pecan, and they milk 200 Holsteins, and they have approximately 2 heifers born per week. And so my question is, what is the maximum group size you would use to keep a reasonable age range within pairs or groups? And so I'm just giving 3 options. Obviously, there's numbers in between that you could consider. And so the first option would be an automatic milk feeder with 15 calves per group. The second option is a group pen with up to 6 calves. And the third option would be pairs or 2 calves together per group. So knowing that 2 heifers are born per week, how would you achieve a reasonable age range? Okay, so the most popular response was automatic milk feeder with 15 calves per group. So if we look at the calf birth rate here, they have about 2 heifers born per week. And so to get 15 calves per group, Then if you wanted them to be only a week apart, it would take about 7 or 8 weeks to form a group. If you wanted them to be 2 weeks apart, then it might take about 4 weeks. And so that would be actually longer than the recommended age range. And so I would say to keep the ages as tight as possible, I would stick with just pairs, so 2 calves per group, so you could keep them about a week apart in age that way. Or potentially you could do groups of up to 4 calves. So then it would take about 2 weeks to form a group, but it was kind of a trick question because I said group pen up to 6 calves. I didn't give 4 as an option. So we'll try another scenario. So now we're back to Cookies and Cream Farm. So this is our farm with 1,200 cows, and they have about 12 heifers born per week. So the question is the same. Knowing that they have 6 times as many heifers born per week, what is the maximum group size you would use on this farm, which could keep a reasonable age range within pairs or groups? So same options: auto feeders with 15 calves per group, group pens with up to 6 calves, or pairs, which is 2 calves. Okay, so the most popular answer again was auto feeder. And I think in this case, this farm has a lot more flexibility to consider that. So they have approximately 12 heifers born per week. So in an average week, it would take just over a week for them to form a group of 15 calves. So I think that that's definitely possible. The calves would on average be less than 2 weeks apart in age, which meets that veterinarian guideline. They could also form smaller groups if that's something they prefer, or even pairs. But with this herd size and heifer calving rate, they have a lot more options. So I'm going to move on. So again, we have a lot of resources out there with a lot more detail about things like hygiene and sanitation practices, a lot of these other health considerations, but I do want to leave time to talk about 2 of the other more common challenges we hear about. So sometimes people talk about housing facilities as this potential barrier for moving from individual to pair or group calf housing. So this is something that people have cited as a potential challenge. And so when we're thinking about housing for pairs or groups, there are a couple questions. So should a farm adapt their existing calf housing and modify that for pairs or groups? Or do they have the finances or the space to potentially design and build new housing? And then another consideration would be, would the social housing strategy, meaning pairs or groups, require some kind of radical shift from the way that they currently manage? So for example, maybe right now they manually feed calves in outdoor hutches, but they're thinking of building a barn and managing auto feeders. Is that something that they think that they can handle? Because that is a pretty radical change. So what I want to mention just in this section is that housing facilities are definitely not one size fits all, and there's definitely not one right way to do it. There are a lot of different options. And so when I'm talking about pair or group housing, I often say pair or group, which is kind of a mouthful, or I say social housing, which just means calves are in social groups instead of individually. And the reason I use those terms is if we just say group housing, a lot of times people are picturing in their heads these larger groups with automatic milk feeding systems, like shown here. So when we had surveyed farmers a few years ago about what they were actually doing, we found that 29% of people said, yes, we are housing calves in pairs or groups in these, sorry, not in pairs. We're housing calves in groups in these barns with automatic milk feeding systems. But actually, the majority of people who responded to our survey were housing calves indoors under the cover of a barn, but with some kind of manual feeding of milk or milk replacer. And so it was 46% total, evenly split between manual feeding, where the calves had their own individual bottles or teat buckets or buckets. And then the other half did manual feeding with some kind of mob feeding system. So in this example here, you can see the milk bar system where there's one bucket with multiple teats to accommodate those calves in the pen. And then just over a quarter of farms who responded to our survey were actually housing their calves outdoors with manual feeding, but using pair or group housing. And so on this slide, what I'm showing is just a few examples in a climate like we have in Wisconsin or Michigan, where you do have seasonal variation, including winter. And so at the top, you can see We have on the left a prefab super hutch or group hutch, which are commonly used for post-weaned heifers, but you can also use those for pair group housing for pre-weaned calves. And then on the upper right side, what you can see is an example of a farm which had existing individual hutches where they just modified the fencing to create pairs. And then on the bottom, somebody kindly submitted these photos to me. So this was an example in Canada where they had this group pen set up outdoors with individual hutches, but the calves could freely choose which hutch they were going to be in, who they were going to share with if they wanted to share. And then what you can see in the little inset there is they had a heated milk house where the calves could go in and use an auto feeder. So it was kind of a unique custom setup there. I don't know if anybody is listening from other types of climates, but we have seen lots of examples of pair and group housing in more arid regions as well. And so on the upper left, what you can see is a calf ranch in the Texas Panhandle. And so my former PhD student, Kim Reuscher, took this picture when she was at a visit back home in Texas. And so what you can see is they also took existing individual calf hutches and connected them with fencing. But you can see this enormous outdoor area in front they called the playground, because in that climate, they don't have to worry as much about inclement weather. So the calves do spend more time playing outside. And then on the bottom, this was a photo submitted to me by somebody after another presentation. They kindly sent me these photos of a client in Arizona who custom built these pens. And it's a little bit hard to see, but these pens do have a shade roof over them. And so you can see they pair housed Jersey calves, but with a lot of ventilation. So the take-home message here is there's a lot of different options. Producers are very creative. They can buy prefab housing, or they can modify housing or make their own. And there's not one size fits all. A common question I get, though, is what exactly is social housing? What about fence line contact? So maybe you have calves in a barn and what divides them isn't a solid panel but wire mesh. Would that be considered a compromise that would allow them some social contact? And my personal opinion is probably not, because research has shown that calves desire full social contact more than just partial or fence line contact. And also, if we think about some of the reasons or advantages of individual housing, if they have fence line contact, you actually aren't preventing calf to calf disease transmission through direct contact or through shared aerosol for respiratory illnesses, as well as shared resources like bedding. And then lastly, there's some evidence that when it comes to consumer or public perception, they wouldn't see that as full social housing. They would still think those calves are separated. They don't have full contact. And so what I'm putting there, a cage is still a cage. It comes from a paper that was talking about an example with chicken housing. So from more of a practical perspective, when we're thinking about calf housing, I mentioned earlier, when we say pair housing, we don't mean take individual hutches and now add, so that now you have two calves in that same space. We do know from research that calves will choose to spend a lot of time together, but it's important to still give them the option to have the same amount of space per calf, especially as they're growing. They really don't fit well into one hutch, and so they need to be able to have access to enough fresh air and clean, dry bedding. So there's not a whole lot of research on what really is the right amount of space. So what we're relying on is kind of expert consensus or expert recommendations. And these are taken mainly from these group automatic milk feeding pens. And so these are recommendations for the amount of usable dry bedded resting space. So it doesn't include the feeding area. And so this is kind of our best guess right now, whether we can really apply this to these other housing types, for example, outdoor hutches. So some people say there should be at least 30 square feet per calf, others say 35, others say 40. So again, it's not really something that's completely decided, and we need more research on this depending on what outcomes you're measuring. But if you are thinking about some of these alternative systems, like taking outdoor hutches and creating pairs, we have to consider your climate and how the weather influences whether or not the calves can actually use the outdoor space as dry, comfortable resting area. So in that example I showed in Texas, oftentimes it might be, as long as it's not too hot, but in Wisconsin in the winter, it might not be as feasible to consider that resting area. So now in this polling question, what I want to talk through is how should the farm actually use their current housing if they wanted to convert it for pairs or groups? So going back to Butter Pecan Farm, this farm currently houses calves in a barn with individual pens, and they measure 4 feet by 8 feet, which is a total of 32 square feet. And currently they alternate the material for the panel. So every other panel is solid, but then the ones in between are wire. So in your opinion, how could the farm adapt their current housing for pairs or groups? So the options are A, the space per calf is already probably adequate and you could remove the wire panels, or B, the space is probably adequate and you could remove the solid panels. And then option C is the space is likely inadequate and you may need to modify the pen size before removing any of the panels. Okay, so it's split. So everybody agrees the space is probably adequate. And one person said I would remove the wire panels, the other said I would remove the solid panels. And so I agree the space allowance is probably adequate, at least based on our best guess right now with expert recommendation. There's 32 square feet per calf, which is above the minimum recommendation of 30 square feet per calf. I think I would probably suggest that the farm remove the wire panels. So these calves already have, some of them have nose-to-nose contact, so every other calf has a solid panel. And so if you removed the solid panels, now you would have fence line contact between pairs. And instead, depending on the ventilation system, because there are reasons actually why people have these wire panels, I would probably be more inclined to remove the wire ones and leave the solid ones so that you have divisions between the pairs. But I think, again, there's not necessarily one right answer here. We'd have to do things like measure the ventilation to see if removing the wire and leaving the solid is a good system. So one more question on this topic. So now we're going back to Sweet Cream Farm, and they currently use individual outdoor hutches. And so if you measure inside the hutch, there's 26 square feet of resting area. And then outside of the hutch, the fenced area has 24 square feet. So if you add them together, that's 50 square feet, and you would actually be doubling that. And so the options here now are, do you think the farm can adapt their current housing for pairs? Option A is the space is probably adequate, and so you could connect the hutches with fencing. Option B is the space might be inadequate, so you might need to consider a barn if that's something possible. And then option C is space might be adequate, but it depends on the climate and the season. So you could connect the hutches, but just know in the back of your mind, this might be just a short-term solution, and you may need to explore some other options down the road. Okay, so everyone chose C. And I would agree, which is probably obvious because I made such a wordy option. But I do think that this is actually kind of a tough one because it does depend on the climate or the season. So I showed a couple example photos earlier, one from Wisconsin, one from Texas. And here in Wisconsin, I would say it really does depend on the season. So sometimes we will see the calves using the outdoor area as clean, dry resting area, but sometimes it really doesn't count. And so based on those recommendations of at least 30 square feet per calf, if you're adding the indoor and the outdoor area together, it far exceeds that. But if you're just looking at the inside area, 26 square feet is below the 30 square feet recommendation. But also we've seen in study after study that calves really like to spend time together. And so in essence, they're only getting 13 square feet per calf. And then as they get bigger, it becomes just very challenging to manage the bedding. And so I think it's possible to do this as a way to tiptoe into pair housing, especially because a farm could choose not to even convert over all the hutches. They could just experiment and try a few pairs first and see how they like it. So I think it can be a nice way to tiptoe in, but I think it's really not the ideal long-term solution compared to something like in a barn where you just have a simple rectangle. If you remove the divider, it's just a bigger rectangle. It's a lot less complex in some ways than this outdoor system. So I want to move on now to the third challenge that comes up when we talk about pair group raising. And I would actually say in the conversations that I have, this is the most common question that I get. And it could be because my focus is on animal behavior, or it could be that a lot of the farms I talk to have kind of figured out calf health. And so now they're thinking about some of these other challenges. So this question is, how do we manage unwanted behaviors when calves are in this social setting, especially cross-sucking? So in this example photo here, you can see cross-sucking on the ear, but calves can suck on other body parts, the navel, the udder. And so when we had done a survey of producers, we asked them, how often do you feel like you see cross-sucking during this pre-weaning period? And so 85% of producers who were using pair or group housing said they saw this kind of behavior at least occasionally during the pre-weaning period. And then we also had some farms using individual housing, but with fence line contact. So the calves were separated by wire, so they could still cross-suck on each other. So 70% of those farms also said they saw at least occasional cross-sucking. But what we didn't ask was what body parts were being targeted. And of course, to do this rigorously, you'd actually have to send a researcher out and take this observation systematically to really understand how much is this truly happening. But we know it's something that does happen, and it's a challenge people bring up a lot. So the reason that people bring it up is because they're worried that cross-sucking will lead to udder damage and result in heifers calving in with blind quarters. I hear this all the time, but unfortunately there's very limited studies that kind of follow the consequences of cross-sucking long term. So there's one study which didn't find any association between cross-sucking and navel infections. And then another one that looked really long-term into the first lactation did not find any association between the amount of cross-sucking that kept going after weaning, and they didn't see any effect on mastitis or somatic cell count in the first lactation. But then another long-term study found greater odds of just udder health issues in the first lactation as a consequence of pair housing compared to individual housing, but they didn't actually measure cross-sucking behavior. So we don't know, is it because of behavior in the pre-weaning period, post-weaning period? We're not really sure what's happening. But I do want to acknowledge that this is an abnormal behavior, and it could indicate a welfare issue. It's also something that producers are really concerned about. So we want to look for ways to reduce cross-sucking. So some good news is that there have been a lot of studies, I just cite a few here, looking at ways to reduce this behavior during the pre-weaning housing period. So we know some pretty solid strategies that are not always a silver bullet, especially if you have jerseys, but we know that you can reduce the amount. And that includes research in my own lab. So the first step is to reduce hunger, specifically in terms of the milk or milk replacement feeding program. So not solids, that is part of it, but mainly the milk. And so one part of that is the volume of milk that's offered. And so research suggests that when you feed about 8 to 10 quarts per day or even more, that this can help reduce the behavior. But solid intakes also matter, especially right around weaning. So we often see a spike in cross-sucking behavior once step-down weaning begins. And so it is really important to do a step down and not just abruptly take away the milk, but very few farms nowadays seem to do that, at least based on the data that we've seen. And ideally, this would be based on starter intake so that they're compensating for the step down in milk. But that can be hard to do in a pair group setting because you can't always know which calf is eating how much. And then the second thing to do is to give the calf some kind of outlet for that suckling instinct. So to provide something for them to direct that suckling behavior to. And so this is an area where there has been a lot of research, and we were able to replicate that on our research farm here at University of Wisconsin. And so we had a study where we offered the calves these slow flow nipple buckets or these slow flow nipples on bottles, and we compared that to open buckets. And what we found was that this indeed really reduced the amount of cross-sucking behavior. And I think a lot of producers have either heard about this kind of research or have figured it out through trial and error on their own. Because when we surveyed farmers, we found that what you can see on the left is the percentage of farmers using some kind of nipple or teat, whether it's a bottle or a bucket with a nipple on it. And so if they used individual housing, then only about a quarter fed calves that way. But if they used pair group housing, then it was completely flipped. So over 3/4 of farms who house calves in pairs or groups feed through some kind of nipple. And I think that if you're going to pair group house, you really need to feed through a nipple, whether it's an auto feeder or a bottle or a teat bucket, or else you're going to have a bad time with cross-sucking. But if that's not possible, there are some other options. So studies have shown if you provide some kind of pacifier in the environment, that it gives calves an appropriate outlet to direct their sucking. So you're never going to be able to persuade a pre-weaned calf not to suck on something. So you want to make sure she directs that behavior towards something that you think is appropriate. And so one of the things that we investigated in my lab was this device called a Braden bottle. And this was initially invented as a way to expose young calves to starter from a young age. So it takes advantage of their natural suckling instinct, and it has this specialized nipple that allows solids to pass through. And so as they suck on it, they start to get a taste of the starter. And so we did find that providing the Braden bottle does reduce cross-sucking, but it's not quite as effective as just adapting the milk feeding method to using some kind of slow flow nipple. So that's still the first thing that I would suggest. So to kind of close out today, I want to just do two more interactive examples. So we'll talk about Sweet Cream Farm again. So in terms of how much milk they feed, they do pasteurized milk twice a day, 3 quarts at a time. So each day at the peak of milk feeding, calves get 6 quarts of milk per day. And the way that they do this is that they start them in bottles until they're 2 weeks old, and then they bucket break them. So they're then drinking milk from open buckets. And then I just have some information about the weaning, but we're actually not going to talk about that. So the question here is, do you think that the daily milk allowances, imagining like a 4-week-old calf, and the milk feeding method are likely to support good calf health, growth, and welfare in pairs or groups, including the ability to minimize cross-sucking? And so the options are, yes, the volume and method are sufficient for pairs or groups. Option B is no, the volume is sufficient, but the method is likely inappropriate. Option C is no, the method is appropriate, but the volume is insufficient. And option D is no, both the volume and method are likely insufficient.
All right, I'm going to close the poll.
Okay. Okay. So the most popular response was no, both the volume and method are likely insufficient. And I would say I agree with that analysis because in this case, 6 quarts per day is not uncommon. I think that that's on par with what much of the industry is doing, although more and more research is suggesting that feeding more is beneficial. But I would say to reduce cross-sucking, that doesn't meet our recommendations of at least 8 to 10 quarts a day, if not more. And then in terms of the method, I would recommend that they not bucket break the calves. If they're going to do pair or group housing, they could stick to bottles or explore some other kind of method like the teat buckets. And so in our last example, now we're going back to Cookies and Cream Farm. So on this farm, they feed milk replacer twice a day, 4 quarts each time, for a total of 8 quarts per day at the peak. So let's say around a 4-week-old calf. And in terms of how they deliver the milk replacer, they also start with bottles for the first 2 weeks of life, and then they bucket break the calves. So they switch them to open buckets. So the question here is exactly the same. If we're thinking about promoting good calf health, growth, and welfare, particularly minimizing cross-sucking, are the method and volume sufficient? Okay, so this time the most popular answer was the same. So no, both the volume and method are likely insufficient. And so I think that's really interesting because I would say that 8 quarts is more than a lot of farms feed, and I would be relatively happy to see this. So I might choose option B. So the volume might be sufficient, but the method is likely inappropriate for the same reasons as the last example. But actually, I'm really a fan of these people who say maybe the volume is even insufficient, because we know from the research that feeding even more is something that does benefit calves. And so I like that optimism and the encouragement to do even better. I like that answer. And so that concludes the examples. And so I want to just wrap up with some take-home messages. So the first take-home message is, remember that social housing of calves can result in numerous benefits. So we're not just talking about one type of benefit for the calves. So we can benefit their physical growth, their social development, their cognitive development, cold stress, many, many different kinds of benefits can result. But I also want to be realistic and acknowledge that there can be challenges. It's not just like flipping a switch and magically going from individual to pair housing. It doesn't always go smoothly. But again, to be an optimist, I do want to say that there are known strategies to address a lot of these challenges. So from a practical perspective, there are a lot of farms out there in the US that are doing pair or group housing successfully that we can follow as blueprints for success. And it's not one size fits all, but there are a lot of different options out there for how farms are succeeding in real life. And I also want to emphasize that there's a lot of scientific research going on to help support identifying practical solutions. So we have a lot of free extension resources available. So again, I have the link to my own website there and the QR code. And I want to reassure you that we do keep these up to date as we gain new knowledge from ongoing research. So we've already gone through one update of some of these fact sheets. And as we see other things that we need to refresh, we are keeping these as living documents that we're updating. And so to close, I'm happy to take any questions, but I also wanted to leave my contact information because I always welcome questions from people who are considering trying pair housing or who have already done so and have questions. I also like to see photos. So I accumulate these photos that people send in to me of examples of how you can make it work in different regions with different housing types and just examples of what people have observed. I love hearing tales from the field. So I welcome you to share. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Van Os. I really appreciate it. And it was so many of the things that you talked about, I just think back to the home farm and other farms that I've been able to visit, of just different strategies people have implemented, and listening to a lot of their experiential knowledge with a lot of these. And it's really interesting where you talk about weaning and the shift of folks who have gone cold turkey weaning to your step down weaning. And I wanted to ask I guess what's weaning schedules or like step down examples you've seen that obviously things work differently for each individual farm, but yeah, what examples have you seen across from what you have seen across farms?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we do know from the research is that if you are going to feed a higher volume of milk, then you probably need to start weaning at a later age than somebody who's on a more limited or restricted milk allowance, where they're trying to encourage the calves to eat more starter sooner. And we do know that starter intake is something that's important to support rumen development, but you have to make sure that they have enough time to acclimate to that. And so you want to make sure not to start weaning too early, and don't set your expectations unrealistically early if you are doing this more generous milk feeding program. And in terms of the step down, in an ideal world, it would be individualized to the calf. And so this is something where I think that as we're seeing more innovations in precision livestock farming, we might be able to do that. So in research settings, you can have automatic milk feeding systems and also have starter feeding systems that are measuring how much each calf is eating, and it's associated to her ID. And so you could see, okay, this calf is probably ready based on her intakes, and you could start weaning her, whereas other calves might need a little bit more time. In terms of on our research farm at UW-Madison, we feed 2 gallons per day at the peak, so 8 quarts across 2 feedings. And when we started doing research on pair housing, when I came to UW, we did have to tweak that step down, and we decided to extend it to a 10-day period, whereas previously they were doing approximately 7 days, because we really wanted to make sure the calves had adequate time to adapt, since now there are 2 calves and they could be competing with each other. other. We really wanted to make sure they were both getting this appropriate opportunity to adapt to the reduction in milk and make sure that they were eating enough starter. So I think, again, it's not one size fits all per farm, and it's not one size fits all to the calf. But in general, the more milk you're feeding, which we think is a good thing for welfare, the later you need to start weaning.
Right. Another question that I thought of was for like the milk bar buckets, what I I think of when I've heard challenges that folks have faced when they have used an automatic calf feeder, where they talk about the overall maintenance, how that was a major transition from being on bottles or using buckets. What things have you come across that folks have said, hey, this is something I had to learn on the job, or this is something when using a milk bar or automatic feeder that was just very different that you see, even maybe it's an individual farm or commonly across the board for folks who are using these different methods?
Yeah, I have met producers that are very passionate because they found a way that works for them. Like I met a producer who really liked the Peach Teat brand, which is another kind of
Yep.
nipple bucket. And the reason that we chose the milk bars is because that nipple is specifically slow flow. And what previous research has shown is that the slower the milk comes out, it prolongs the length of the milk meal. And that is part of how you reduce cross-sucking and other abnormal oral behaviors, is you need to make sure the calves spend enough time actually suckling, because there's kind of a time course to that behavior. And so while they're drinking and then for about 20 minutes after, the calves have this instinct to suck on things. And so if you can prolong the milk meal so they're not just chugging a gallon of milk, that can help. It also produces more saliva. So that's why we wanted to choose that. But I don't get any I don't get any thing for saying, I'm not recommending a specific brand. It's more like
Right.
the concept of the slow flow. But one of the challenges with that is that it can be difficult for like a newborn calf. And so they offer a colostrum nipple that's softer. We did end up having to use that. And then we switched them over to the harder
Okay.
to use nipples after a few days. In terms of the buckets themselves, our research farm actually usually does feed calves from bottles, regular bottles first, and then switch them to open buckets. And so it was a challenge for them to decide, how are we going to deal with cleaning these, removing the nipples and replacing them on the buckets? It can be tough. And when we decided to do research on this topic, we just worked with our farm managers and we said, hey, we don't want this to become even more difficult for you. Just like what I said earlier, we don't want it to be a radical departure from your normal management. And so they asked us if we were going to do this in the winter, which we did. After doing it in the summer, can we please switch to bottles? Because they didn't want to deal with the open buckets in the winter. And so now actually that brand does make a slow flow nipple that can twist onto a 4-quart bottle. So you can actually get that milk volume even in 2 feedings per day. And so that was a really nice adjustment. But I think it depends on the farm. So some farms really like bottles because they have a dishwasher. Other
Right.
farms really prefer buckets. And I think that that's, again, just kind of personal preference. What's really important is feeding milk through some kind of nipple.
Okay. Yeah, I think about when I fed calves, you're really slow drinkers where you feed them and then you feed a couple others and then you go back saying, okay, are you drinking? Are you not drinking? And so with that, I say case study, that example, what things have you seen where whether you notice that calf is paired with another calf who just is cruising along, or even as individual calves, and you're considering potentially switching up the feeding method that may be easier or less intense in the way of just how much they have to work to get that milk meal.
Yeah, and I think that that is an important consideration, and there can be trade-offs there. So that was a concern that our research farm staff had too. And so in terms of when we paired the calves, actually, it was in these outdoor hutches. So we used a mesh divider. So when the second calf was born, they actually had fence light contact for a few days. And then at the staff's discretion, they would tell us, okay, I think that both of them are strong enough now to be able to have this healthy competition. So then we would remove the divider and
Okay.
have full social contact. Because that was a concern, was what if the younger calf or the more timid calf loses out and the other one
Right.
kind of outcompetes her. But we also explicitly quantified this competitive behavior, and other studies have as well. And we found that there wasn't necessarily a lot of competition while the calves were actively drinking. It was after the milk was done and they couldn't see into those buckets because they're opaque, that then they were like knocking each other off to see, okay, is there actually still milk in that other
Mm,
one? And so
okay.
what some studies have suggested is you can have some distance between where the calves are feeding if they're in a pen, or you can even put a divider. And so it's um in that Texas example I showed, it's kind of hard to see from the photos. They have this outdoor fenced area and they feed with bottles. And I think they actually drop 2 bottles per calf. So it's four bottles per pair. But there's a little section of the mesh that kind of sticks out and makes the barrier so that when they're feeding, they can't just scoot over and knock each other off. They'd have to actually kind of go around the U. And so
Oh,
that was
okay.
how they addressed that potential for competition.
Yeah, because that was another thing. I can't remember where I saw it, but I believe it was in a study where they were trying to figure out on the labor side if it was more intensive to have to use a physical divider or to just say, hey, we'll get in there when we see the calves
Mhm.
going after um each other's bottles or
Mhm.
buckets. And do you have you has your lab looked into that a little bit?
So we have not, but there are other labs, including University of Florida, University of Guelph, places in Europe that have looked at ways to reduce competition. I will say that there is another option I didn't mention, which some farms do, which is they have little mini calf headlocks. And so they have pair group housing, but then they'll lock them up at milk feeding time.
Mm,
And
yeah,
they'll leave access to the bottle or the bucket, which also helps with the cross sucking because then they have enough time to suckle before they take that stuff away to clean it.
right.
But that is another way to make sure they can't directly outcompete each other.
Another question for the starter, I always hear of folks where, hey, I just want a complete pellet. I don't want to deal with texturized feed. Have you looked into like preferences for the calves for texturized feed versus complete pellet and how that could influence cross-sucking behavior?
Boy, I have not, and I'm sure that there is research out there comparing calf presence preferences, and I can't remember the results. I do know that there are groups looking at just providing hay to
Yeah.
calves as a way to reduce abnormal behaviors, and that there is some potential there. But in terms of the texturized versus pelleted starter, I'd have to go look it up. I don't know the answer.
Oh, that's okay. I know just with everything else, there's farmers' preference of nope, they want textured versus complete
Mhm.
pellet, and it's really interesting where some folks are saying, it's easier on the calf. It has that really strong molasses smell, so the calves are more drawn to the textured feed, or well, the complete pellet, it has everything that calf needs. I know it's going to get the
Mhm.
nutrients and it can't sort through it where, when I've fed calves, sometimes you see just corn kernels sitting at the bottom and you're like,
Mhm.
well, I guess your quality control for the day. So, um, if I want to remind the folks who are attending, if you do have any questions, please throw them in the question and answer. So, um, I So yeah, and I'm trying to think of where it was. I can't remember if it was the space allowance or if it was another portion that you brought up. Oh, it was also the benchmarking for the pre-weaned calf mortality rate.
Mhm.
Do you do you know how often the gold standards are updated? And I'm not sure if you have worked intimately with how those standards are set, since I know you do a lot of research in the area of calf health and calf behavior,
Mhm.
and looking at space allocation and all that. But yeah, I'm curious if you have some inside knowledge of how those standards are set and um how how we've come about with the widen categories of your excellent, good, fair, and poor, because we
Mhm.
look at that. And then also we've seen changes in colostrum quality, like everything in that kind of gold standard setting.
Yeah, I know a little bit about the Dairy Calf and Heifer Association Gold Standard. So that's a document that they put together with expert guidance and based on the research to just suggest here's what we think are some guiding benchmarks. And so there's no standard around it. Like you don't earn a certificate for meeting them. It's more just setting your own goals to
Mhm.
strive to. And so I don't believe that they have a set update schedule. So the last time I kind of talked to them in depth about it was over 4 years ago. And so at that time, I can't remember the year that that version was published, but they put together like a supplement
Mhm.
to add some additional guidance around. Actually, I think it was housing space allowance for weaned heifers that they wanted to add some information there from the Dairyland Initiative through UW-Madison. And so it's not like the farm program, the farm animal care program, which has a set schedule for updates. I
Mhm.
think there it's much looser, and I'm not sure exactly how they decide it. But with some of those space allowance things we talked about, it's again just sort of expert opinion and what they've observed in terms of certain outcomes relating to these large group calf pens in barns based on the amount of bedded clean resting area, which is also related if you go into the third dimension with how many
Mhm.
cubic feet of air is available in the barn for air exchange. So I think it depends on what outcomes you care about,
Yeah.
which will dictate what you think, what kind of space allowance you think is adequate. Because what I also didn't talk about is space allowance also affects play behavior, and that might not be something that some people really value, but other people think that it's important. So that
Right.
farm I showed in Texas, initially, they started out with this smaller fenced area. It would have been more than adequate according to those guidelines, but the employees saw the calves playing a lot and they really enjoyed that and they had the space. So they decided to just expand and allow the calves to have this larger playground. So I
Yeah.
think there's not necessarily one right answer there yet.
Right.
The passive transfer guidelines, those were updated by Sandra Godin and Jason Lombard and others who worked together over the years to move from this kind of pass-fail criterion to look at the distribution across farms and how those related to calf morbidity and mortality outcomes. And so they decided it would be more nuanced to put together like the excellent, good, fair, poor
Mhm.
categories based on that distribution in the population instead of just saying, here's the cutoff for pass fail.
Right. Right. And I think that really plays into providing producers and managers a step up where it's okay, hey, this is
Mhm.
where we're at. Majority of our calves are sitting in this fair group. How do we get to good? And then how do we
Mhm.
get to excellent? And so whenever I look at like binary scales as the method of saying you're doing a good job, I, as a scientist, but also as a very type A person, I'm like, no, I want some numbers behind it. I want to be able to see and know that, am I really needing it? And is there a way I can just get better and better and better and
Mhm.
improve the overall, um, in this case, passive transfer in my calves? And so I think it's really exciting where we're seeing more of that and more or better applicable scales that can be developed. And we're when looking at, animal behavior, it's it's a great opportunity when we're able to quantify it and say, hey, we see this is a desired behavior, or this is behavior that's linked to XYZ thing. And here's a way you can either A, keep track of it on your farm, or here's a method that you can see it paid off, or
Mhm.
we have this greater space that allows for more play activity, or you have the pair housing or the group housing and you're seeing more or improved social grooming of one another and bonding and all of these different things that now we're seeing through the research, through the longitudinal studies of, hey, this actually impacts production, health, and handling new stressors and novelty within the different life stages and things these cows are going through. And so I think it's really interesting how we're getting all of this really neat information where we're able to meld together the qualitative and quantitative stuff
Mhm.
and all the things where I'm just, this is why I love animal behavior and welfare. because we're finally able to get numbers behind a lot of this stuff and say, hey, this is how it's actually impacting these animals long term.
Yeah, there's always more to learn.
Oh yeah. So I am going to just share our wrap-up slide real quick. I know we're a
Okay.
little bit over time, but that's what happens when you're having fun and talking about things you enjoy. So please contact either one of us if you do have any follow-up questions, and you will be able to access this recording via YouTube and anywhere you listen to podcasts. And if you have a second, please scan the QR code and let me pull if I can pull it up, maybe not. Let me pull the survey link into the chat. It's always fun trying to go between all the windows. There we go. And so you'll be able to fill out that survey. Just let us know your thoughts on the session today. And if there are any other topics that you have thought of that we could put together for you in the future, let us know. And thank you so much for attending and being engaged and involved with our poll questions that we have for today. And once again, thank you, Dr. Van Os, for your wonderful talk, and have a wonderful evening, everybody.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for joining, everyone.